All right. So if you're here, my name is Alejandro Macias. I'm currently at Presa House at my show in Plain Sight in San Antonio, Texas. I'm an artist originally from Brownsville, Texas, born and raised. And I'm currently an assistant professor at the University of Arizona School of Art, where I teach painting and drawing. Thank you, Summer, for being here.
Yeah, hi Alex, thanks for having me. And big hello to Rigo and Janelle and Presa House and everybody in Texas and everybody with us today live. Um, I'm Sama Alshaibi. I'm a professor at the School of Art also, but in photography and video and imaging. And Alex is my newest colleague and dear friend. I'm very honored to be invited here to have this conversation with you about your work and your show, just a series of topics. So I thought we could just kind of start by framing the show a little bit. I know probably a lot of people here already went to the website and saw what's being hung on the walls, but I just want to give a little context for some people that might be just joining us new. So the work. What are we seeing? Year range? Is it a single project? Is it multiple works? Different projects?
I feel like the work is typically has been ongoing since like 2017. I think in 2017 is when I started to kind of explore my identity as a Mexican American artist from Brownsville, Texas. And Brownsville, if many don't know, is at the southernmost point of Texas. And so with the exception of maybe like two small pieces, most of the work is from between 2019 and 2020. I think I even finished my last one like maybe like a month or 2 months before I even the exhibition. So it's a lot of it's very, very recent.
So some of it was done during the isolation, stay-at-home time.
Yeah, and I felt it was like I had some sort of responsibility to even respond to that. I felt like I needed to say something. Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll get to that in a little bit, but still doing a little background framework on this, on all the works that are there and in your practice in general. So we talked about Brownsville, right? So that's a borderland, and then you moved to Tucson, Arizona, right? Also a borderland. And what was that experience like for you as a person going into this different university, but also how it went into your work?
Yeah, so I think even like it was interesting because when I even like Aaron Coleman, our colleague, he was in the search committee and he picked me up from the airport. And even when I drove from the airport I was staying like close to the university. And even then, like there's something about it that reminded me of Brownsville. It felt like small and like kind of like big at the same time. So even like leaving the airport, I felt like very comfortable. And I think there's a lot of parallels between Brownsville and Texas in terms of even the feel that I get from it, so that was not very like shocking to me. I think even like going from a small city like Brownsville to Tucson wasn't much of a culture shock. I think there was a lot of similarities in between. Well, like Brownsville is like 95% Hispanic, right? Whereas like I'm not entirely sure of statistics when it comes to Tucson. I would think it's like what 30-40% maybe. Hispanic. I'm not entirely sure.
It depends if we're talking about Tucson or Pima, but yeah, it's a little bit higher, I think, in Tucson.
Yeah. So even like the demographic, I think even like UA being a Hispanic serving institution, there was a lot of, I felt very comfortable in terms of even the students that I was talking to. But the climate is different, much drier in Tucson. That was something that was not, I wasn't really necessarily used to, but I actually prefer it over the humidity. But yeah, I don't think it was a huge shift within me, and even I think there was like a subtle shift in my work. I think being away from Brownsville, where I grew up the majority of my life, I've spent over plus 30 years there, and then to not know anyone outside of my colleagues, that was the most difficult part, I think. And I in some works, I talk about that in a subtle way.
Feeling a little alienated?
In a way, yeah.
But that's something you actually deal with in your work, but in a different way, right? Like through the process of assimilation, of feeling alienation, maybe not away from everyone you know, but suddenly going from a culture that was largely Spanish speaking, everyone was around you, and then having to do this assimilation process. Maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, so just to kind of grasp or give some context into some of the work that I've been doing that deals with assimilation, I came from like a family that spoke spiritually. Like my grandparents speak only Spanish. My parents have like thick accents, but they can speak English. And so growing up, I only spoke Spanish, and then until like third grade, I started taking bilingual classes, and that's when I started to kind of incorporate English into my to my languages. And so that was interesting because when I started to be around other classmates that spoke only English or a mixture of both, I found myself being corrected, many times. And that was like even a kind of a traumatic experience. And so something triggered in me that was like, well, I don't want to feel like an outcast anymore. Like I want to be able to feel like I belong. And so moving to Arizona, I felt it's like almost like a repeat in a sense. Like, man, like I definitely want to feel like I fit in. Like I don't want this to be a difficult process. I want to be able to get acclimated quickly, understand the culture and the student culture. So it's different, but definitely I'm revisiting a lot of those memories from when I was a child.
So that's kind of goes into the subject of passing. But we'll get to that in a second because I want to bring that up in particular through the frame of some of your works. I wanted to just emphasize something that I heard in one of your talks or maybe one of our conversations, many of our conversations we've had in my backyard pre-COVID.
Yeah.
When we used to be able to get together physically. And that you talked about being a figurative painter, right? And this being the figure itself, being a vessel for the issues that are most important to you. And I'm someone that uses my own body in my artwork as well as a site. And so this figurative representation has kind of been on this arc or this process in your work. And then in this last group that I've been seeing from this show, but we've been doing over the last 2 years, you've talked about sort of in Brownsville that there was just a lot of respect for having this strong rendering, right? And this representational kind of work. And then now maybe you're giving yourself some more experimental room to change the marks or play with the concept. I also wonder if it's a growth process of thinking of representation is a little bit more complex than how we surface appear, right? And that you're holding these bridges between where you're from, where you went to, these conversations, and that it's a representation, but it's in a different kind of way.
Yeah, I think even in undergrad, there was something within me that said like I want to be a figurative painter, and I never really understood why. It's not until like even like maybe 3 years after I graduated from grad school that it's like, well, I can use the figure as a vessel to talk about issues that are important to me, but even talk about the style, and the aesthetic, like what is it that I want to say? There's a lot of things that I want to say, and so I think the figure lended itself to talk, and the media that I was using, especially when incorporating the split, there's a lot of division in terms of the media in my work, to talk about identity, and then using like the traditional rendering to talk about Brownsville and then where I came from, and then incorporate this new media, like new, right? But it's just more of for what felt new to me, because I didn't want to be stuck in this kind of bubble of traditional rendering, and so I used the kind of the split technique and the variety of media to be able to talk about identity and how I was feeling and how I was going through this kind of assimilation process. It's just for me really interesting and just crazy how it took me like my late 20s to realize what was happening in my childhood, and then using the figurative way to talk about it.
Well, I mean, it's crazy, but in a way, it's maybe self-preservation too, right? Because it's I mean, when you have a skin color that, as you said, passes, but then you come from a culture that is not going to pass, you're negotiating a kind of space within your family structure, and then outside of your family structure, into the world, and so although you might be able to cross the street without being pegged right
Mm,
away, those kinds of violations that happen in more invisible spaces, whether they might be in the institutions or in the classrooms or in the churches or in relationships, in the ways that people speak to each other, they're absorbed, and over time you kind of have to deal with it, right?
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting also, like, I think even using the work as a way to talk about not only how I'm feeling, but even addressing race. Like, even when we talked about it recently, how, and I mentioned this even in the talk when I was getting interviewed at UA about when I was at Vermont Studio Center, you know, being around a group of white artists and not feeling like I was outside of that. You know, I felt like I almost like a chameleon in a way, you know, and then be able to identify with the people of color as well, because I am Mexican American, and I can identify with how people feel with people of color. But the fact is, I have very light skin, you know, and so um, I'm using the work to document that, and you know, even have a sense of a dialogue with other people who might be feeling in a similar way.
In a way, I wonder if your light skin, though, it has put this in an extra sort of pressure or complication of the threat to this cultural obliteration, right? I mean, I think a lot of us that come from families uh, that are in the yellow to brown scales, it's strange because we can have members of our family that have darker skin and lighter skin,
Mm-hmm.
or darker eyes and lighter eyes. And I always noticed that in my own family, I had brown skin, darker eyes. I couldn't pass, right? And so
Yeah.
the cultural obliteration was not even a question of something I could able to do in the way that maybe my sister could do. And so, but then you could move to a place like Arizona in a very heightened time of just this vitriol against immigrant communities and against migrants, and you know, with the rise of President Trump and all the
Mm-hmm.
people that follow him, it's your name and your last name, or even that it's a possibility, right? It totally shifts. That negotiation is totally different. Did your awareness come to be before this sort of rise of Trump and everything he brought along with it? Although I would say things like this were happening before Trump. For sure, he fed into something that was already there.
Yeah, I think there was always that, you know, even when I'm thinking about skin color, I think that was always something in the back of my mind. But it definitely was amplified with Trump. I started doing. Never did I even tackle on anything political until he was a candidate, actually. And so I did a work that responded to him speaking about Mexicans and him vilifying Mexicans as like these rapists and thieves. And so I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I was like, what is happening here? And so for me, that was, I was more in tune with politics after that. And I started to kind of at least become aware and a bit more informed. And so I was like, and then I started thinking about my grandparents. My grandparents migrated from Mexico. And then I started thinking about like, oh, they're like dark. And then like my parents are like lighter, and then I'm light. So like there was like a shift there in terms of color, but they're family. And so like I started thinking about the shift of color, and then like and then like even yeah, and I started thinking about also like the Rio Grande Valley and Brownsville, where I'm from. There's a spectrum of color there, you know. I have a lot of students who are dark, a lot of students who are light, but they identify with one another.
That's
And
given the history, right, of colonialism and everything. That, of
mm,
course, and slavery, that makes a lot of sense.
yeah, yeah, and then even like I hope I'm not jumping ahead too much, but even like in the work in Lo Pan La Frente, I made that work because it was a saying from my mom that I often heard growing up, and it was like me abandoning my heritage and not have anything to do with it, and trying to fit in, and then feeling American. And I know that in Brazil I would feel fine. I was born and raised there. You know, I feel comfortable with my family and friends. But what happens if I move elsewhere? If I moved into the East Coast, maybe not New York, because New York is pretty diverse, but to like a predominantly white population, how would I feel there? I mean, and even saying no pan en la frente, you know, what exactly does it mean? Like, I heard it because I was almost drifting away from my heritage, but I think my mom brought it up as if, like, there's no drifting away. You are who you are. Visually, I think visually, even in Mexico, and I was speaking to someone who came to the gallery from Mexico City who has dark skin, that says that no pan en la frente is a very racist term because you have like white-skinned Mexicans using the term to belittle dark-skinned Mexicans. You know, it's or of the people of indigenous descent. You know, so so I thought that was really interesting.
So no pan en frente, just for the audience, is that it's a split. It's the drawing on the bottom of the half, and the top half is the cactus as a head.
Yeah, exactly.
Explain why.
Yeah, so again, going back to that division of technique, I, you know, coming from Brownsville, most of the work that was respected was typically representational, well-rendered, realism, figurative, landscape, stuff like that. And so I'm going back to that shift about using the work as a metaphor for how I'm feeling. And then going from the neck up, using the experimental technique to talk about my Americanization. And so using the nopal, like nopal is cactus, and it's in forehead, and it using the cactus as like to talk about that, you know, that shift in identity or how you're feeling in terms of that transition. But then even then, like using that, like it's clearly identifiable, right? No matter if you were dark and you didn't want to be dark, you're dark, you know, and so using the cactus as a way to talk about that.
Right. So I was really looking at many of your works and thinking about the different themes that run throughout them, and I probably, if I had hours, I could go through each one and talk about how they do almost all of these in your works. But just, you know, just to be a little bit more organized about time. So that work, I really thought about a major theme of your work, which is foregrounds all of your work, right, these days, which is the border is an obstacle, right? The border is an obstacle. The border as an obstacle. And so the border as an obstacle, in No Para la Frente, I'm sorry, I'm learning pronunciations. That one is, it's physically bordered. The body becomes not even a body. It's a different kind of form, right? It's a platform, the cactus. It has an internal insider kind of language between something that you would know, but as if we were sitting here in the United States, if we don't have that background, we would read it in maybe some different ways. But the idea of the border being an obstacle, and the idea of being split or divided, and something even not human but different and like located into a landscape is very embedded and infused into that. So it locates where you're from to this kind of place in the Southwest that has that. So you can't even separate yourself from it. You can't escape it. That's there if you don't even understand Spanish. So I think of the border as an obstacle very much in that work as the internal. As the external, I think about the physical border as the space between, and I thought you could talk about that.
So in the works, the space between, I'm using specifically the Sarapa design that you see above the self-portrait as a way to talk about my Mexican upbringing. Like, again, speaking Spanish, culturally surrounded by everything Mexican, you know, and then again, when in my childhood, there was a shift. So you see in the portrait, I'm covering myself with an American flag, almost as if I'm using it as a camouflage. You know, I don't want to be identified as anything else. And then you see like a literal gap or a cut between my Mexican,
around the outline.
Yeah, and there's I'm like as if I'm literally separating away from the work, and so I'm distancing myself literally. But then even the space acts as also as a metaphor for talking about Brownsville, and because there's again going back to the spectrum of people, I don't see it as a black and white place. It's definitely culturally a blend of both Mexican and American. There's many students that I've met along the way, and I'm talking about myself as well, who don't identify with just being Mexican. Like if I were to go into Mexico, I would definitely feel like an outcast. And then if I went into like a predominantly white city, I'd be like, well, I don't feel like I would probably bring up something culturally that people will never be able to identify with. And so then I would feel like an outcast as well. So then that space is Brownsville in the Rio Grande Valley. It's not easily defined. It exists, but it's definitely difficult to kind of, like I said, define, or like even, it's a spectrum of people, but we all understand where we're from. And yeah, and so it exists, but like, how does it exist? I don't know how to even explain it. So it's not like a black or white. It's a huge blend of all these things.
Right. I really was drawn to the gap it created by separating them. The Zarapa design, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That has obviously a very specific iconography and a history, and then the bottom, obviously, with your body, and then the American flag. Those speak something. But to me, what was so fascinating, I mean, it's all fascinating, but together it's the gap, right? And this like physical separation and that space of evoking the River Grande, but also just this distance and what the imagined of the gap of what you imagined you have to cross to negotiate that conversation and to belong into other. And so I was thinking about that gap when I thought about the voids in your work, how disappearance and voids also come into your work. Primarily, I was looking at that I wanted to talk about was water that divides and consumes, because it's got disappearance and it has void. The bodies are to the back of us, right? So we only see their backs. So their individuality, their rendering, their who they are is hidden from us. It's robbed. We can't. Their humanity is robbed, and at the same time, the legs are also partially missing, and so something has like completely floated away. Whether it's their individuality, what they suffered to get here, their humanity. And I know that was about from El Salvador, right? That was coming to Brownsville, for a man from there, or maybe you could tell us the story.
Yeah, so that work went viral last year, and I think it was through Time magazine. I can't remember where it went viral through, but it was all over the internet. It was so, and this is obviously when the topic of families being separated is often talked about in mainstream media, and so that it was easy for that image to go viral. But it was a father and daughter from El Salvador who crossed from Matamoros, or tried to attempt to cross from Matamoros into Brownsville. And so the daughter, she was actually the one being like on a raft, crossed over first, and I think she didn't want to be away from the father, so she fell into the water. And so the father tried to rescue her, and I guess the current was too strong, so they both drowned, and they both washed up into the Brownsville side, and so I thought it was incredibly devastating. Like I look at the daughter, I mean, like, and seeing her look, like, for me the most striking image of that photograph is like seeing the little tiny shoes. Like, I don't know, there's something about that, it hits me much harder. And but yeah, going back to about the disappearance is like I drew it because when you see them face down, the father's knees are like in the water, so they're difficult to define. So it looks like part of his legs are like disappearing within the work, and but you can see that the daughter like completely. And but I also talk about these works about migrants because they're issues that are obviously affecting people from the border and migrants, but they're so easily dismissed. And for people that choose not to understand. It's like a lot of willful ignorance, I think, and choose not to understand. It's completely dismissed, forgotten. It disappears. You know, you can make it disappear from your consciousness, but the fact is the issues are there. They're not going away. More people will cross. So it's definitely something that's incredibly important. And so in that work also, like exploring media again, like it was a rendered father and daughter in graphite, and then I incorporate the water in a very loose manner as a way to talk about the naive, childlike quality that you know that comes from children, you know, painting and drawing on walls, and so and even like kind of this swift motion, it's something that I did as a child, you know, many children do, as a way to identify they're talking about water. But I use the water as a way to reinforce the fact that like we have a child here who was robbed from a child in the U.S. and who knows what their life could have been like or potentially could have been like. But the fact is, it's gone. You know, and I used in the title, you know, water that consumes. It consumes their lives and it divides families. And so you know, now you have a mother who is not only has her boyfriend or partner, but no longer has her child. So this water definitely separates and consumes lives.
Yeah, and this water is hollowed ground. It's where people. It's a graveyard.
Yeah.
And I think of just for this past like 5-6 years with all the migration that's been coming out of Africa and out of Syria and crossing seas, a whole other part of the world. But it's just tragic that the conditions that people don't understand, that there's conditions that are pushing people out of their homes. People don't choose to leave their homes in this kind of manner, right? They don't choose to get on a raft, separate themselves from their child, so their child makes it, and then or cross a desert in over 100 degrees without water because they're trying to take or rob something from American citizens. This is not an opportunity quest, you know.
Yeah.
This is a quest of desperation, of a matter of life and death. And that was the only kinds of way parents will make these kinds of decisions, or families will make these kinds of decisions. And I look back at that piece, I also was struck by the childlike waves and, you know, the kind of rendering that would be in a children's book. As a parent, that really felt that's, you know, sometimes something so simple can speak volumes about her innocence, about the way we tell stories, right, through images. And then, yeah, you know, the hand tucked into the shirt behind, you know, for that protection, and this, like, a child completely expects their parent to be able to, you know, save them and protect them, and the sort of hopelessness that parents feel when they get to our border and then their children are snatched from them, or they're given a choice, either your child can come in the United States and live and you would be separated. I mean, what kinds of choices, what kind of people have we become in the United States to allow for this to happen, or to forget that this is happening?
Yeah, it's such a, like, for me, it's kind of troubling how people, you know, have a sense of or lack of empathy, and this is the ultimate desperation, and it is the ultimate sacrifice because they know they can die crossing. You know, what are they running?
And likely to die. But what else is there to do, right?
It is the only choice they have left. You know, they're struggling. If they stay behind, they die. And so even the possibility of living when you could die on the process is a choice that I can't even imagine.
Well, I think this goes back to like why cultural obliteration is also extremely violent, because if we've all assimilated into something, which I don't even know what it becomes, right? If it's not this remembering of what our families sacrificed to either come here, or if they were already here when they were colonized and settled upon, right? Let's not forget that. Or dragged here. Like, what are the reasons in chains? Like, why can't we have that as well? What are we trying to assimilate into, to be accepted? It's not, anyway. So I'm going to go into the work because it's better to talk through the work. So that goes into camouflage and masks. I think that's a big part of your work, and you've referenced that a little bit here and there in the beginning. I'm looking at two works, one of which is not in the show, but I think is a very powerful and pivotal work of yours called American Mexican, and the other one is, we talked about a little bit, which is Hidden in Plain Sight. So the mask component of American Mexican is kind of fascinating to look at right now, post-COVID, or like during COVID. And I always think it's very interesting how art can encompass new meanings and grow and stretch to bring more into it when it's made in this kind of incredibly sensitive and complicated way, that it has layers and people can see themselves into it that maybe didn't have the artist's origins to it. And so I'd love to talk about that, and I'd love to talk about the Sarapa, like so I would define it for the audience that may not know what that is, and then and the newer work where it's hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, so American Mexican, I did that one in 2019, and by then I was already incorporating the division, again, talking about the bicultural experience, and specifically my response to Brownsville and how people saw art, and how I tied that to my Mexican-American identity. And so like the bottom half has a Sarapa design, which should mention that I appropriated from my mentor, Carlos Gomez, who often used the Sarapa design into his work. So he was an important figure in what I do now, and talking about the Chicano Mexican-American experience. And so the bottom half has the red, white, and blue color palette and the Sarapa design to talk about me assimilating. And then you have like the Mexico hat as a way to also talk about my Mexican upbringing. So, and so I thought it was, yeah, it's interesting how whenever I make work, there's always an intent. There's always something there. And so everything has a meaning or a purpose. And so that division, the design, the cultural Sarapa design is an important cultural textile and design from Mexico. So I'm bringing that into the work, but also using the red, white, and blue American color palette.
But in an interchangeable way, right? Taking it away from the flag and then bringing it into the design, right?
Yeah.
And the hat doing in the reverse, sort of like looking at over here.
Yeah. So yeah, that was the intention, and the division was the whole intention. But I'm also interested in how you talked about it. You almost see it as a mask, and I often talked about masks in my work, and they're clearly masks. Like I'm literally putting on a mask on to talk about like whitewashing, about assimilation, like transcending color, transcending identity. But now because of the pandemic, people might confuse it as a mask. And so I have no problem with the context changing. In fact, I kind of even embrace it. But I will always be transparent and sincere about my intention. But I embrace it because that gives me new ideas for like new works. And so I think it's important that those ideas are brought forward for me to be aware of them. I think if there's a dialogue between the viewer and me, they're not only aware of the intention, but I'm aware of how it can be interpreted, how I can take this work in a different direction. The Hidden in Plain Sight was directly a response to from me moving from South Texas to Arizona, and even if you compare Mexican American and Hidden in Plain Sight, I've reversed it in the subject matter. You have Hidden in Plain Sight like a rendered landscape, whereas the figure in American Mexican is rendered and it has a flat background, whereas the figure in Hidden in Plain Sight is flat. And so, but I talk again about not only my transition and moving to a new home, a new place, different terrain. I'm moving to the desert, dry climate, rather than a humid climate. And but then again, even trying to fit in, and then using that kind of like using the similar palette from the background into the foreground to the figure as a way to camouflage myself, and also talking about the migrant experience, about using the Arizona desert as a landscape as an obstacle for many migrants, and they often disappear. Many of them are never found, so they perish, and then some are only can be identified because of like their ID, their identification, or whatever. So I think
Right. I
that
mean, that
work.
goes to the other two works, which I'm sort of interrupting, but I wasn't
Mhm.
going to bring them up, but I will bring them up because they also deal with a silhouette that camouflages
Yeah.
the silhouette of a form of a body,
Hmm.
and then the landscape, which is Death of the Migrants, California, Texas, and Arizona.
Yeah. So I did these. That I just like.
Those
I
are
don't
ones
think.
behind you.
Yeah, I did these. So I actually did this one first, and so when I was interested, I was talking to another colleague of mine from a different department. I can't remember the long term for the department, but I think it was the College of Humanities, I believe. And Jonathan Chrisman, he was also a new colleague of a new hire, and so I met him at the like new faculty orientation, and so he said, "Oh, I've been doing actually all this research on migrant death, and I've actually been to Brownsville." And what's so crazy, like, not to get off topic, but the painting that Rigo owns, that's mine. It's like a conservative wearing the MAGA hat, but he's like Mexican, and he saw that painting, Jonathan, my colleague, at this show called Young Latinx Artist 23 at Mexicarte, and he saw that painting in Austin, and then we met later, which I found like really interesting also. And so anyway, so he talked to me about all this research he had done, and so that really like, man, why am I not talking about like Arizona and the obstacle it is for migrants? And so I was doing some research, and I found an article about like how dangerous this terrain is and how people disappear, and it's brutal, and it's very unforgiving, and the only way they can identify people is through their IDs, if they can find it. And so I found, so there's a picture of a woman's ID, and so I used the silhouette from the ID here, and then I kind of loosely, it's not really an identifiable, maybe obvious part of the Arizona landscape, but I wanted to get that across, that it's the She Parish crossing the desert. And so then I did one of a child, the Rio Grande River, and many, like countless people have died crossing. So that isn't anyone in particular, but it's just it could have been anyone. But I wanted to focus on the child, and so I made it like intentionally smaller compared to the others. And then you have another one, and this is obviously different from the other ones because you have like this like natural landscapes, and then you have the San Diego like skyline. And so this one is a very specific person, and his name is Anastasio Rojas, who had a family in San Diego and lived there for decades, and had a common law wife, had children, and he was deported, and then tried to cross back to get back to his family, which is understandable. Like, why would you want to be separated from your family? And he was detained,
That's
and
not
he
a
was,
choice. He would do it
yeah,
again.
yeah. And I think he did it at least twice, and he was detained, and then he was beaten to death, like while he was detained. So although they're different, this is his home. These are like natural landscapes. They all died under very different circumstances, but they're all looking to have the U.S. as their home, And so I was interested in using these different obstacles and how they all have their own stories.
I also want to mention that the sales of those particular works are being donated, right?
So yeah, so anything that deals with migrant death, it feels incredibly wrong to be able to profit from the migrant struggle and migrant experience, especially when they have died. So all that money is being donated to humanitarian organizations like No More Deaths, and I have to do more research on Texas organizations because I want to be able to divide that any proceeds to an Arizona and Texas organization.
Excellent, great. Well, I want to go back to American Mexican. And by the way, if we have any collectors in the house, if you have collectors, it's a great way to
Yeah.
donate and have an incredible work. I've been studying those all for the last few days, and I just think
Yeah.
they're powerful.
Thank
They
you.
the rendering is powerful, the story is powerful, the camouflage, the way it's absent and present at the same time, how it depicts the sacred ground, how it talks about the space that they take in this journey, what it disappears into. It's, to me, some of the most complex works you've done, and I think they're phenomenal. All your works are very complex, but I love those in particular. Okay, so American Mexican, back to talking about the mask, and I know the intention, and I know that it's not in this COVID moment, but I think of art as being like living, breathing documents or objects that have a meaning in the time that they were made, and they have a meaning in the moment that we view them and we talk about them, and that's how they keep their stories alive. And I also think that they're extremely relevant, not just because they're a mask, but because the mask has become politicized by the very person that politicized migrant movement, right? Like moving towards life. And the very people that are standing against in this opposition are standing in this opposition of the mask. And to see that together, I have to tell you, I was just flying through my Instagram late at night, which I'm sure everybody does when they can't sleep. And I didn't see the title. I didn't read it. I just saw it. And I'm like, oh, hell yes. Like this brings up all of, I don't know if that's what Alex was doing. I don't know when he made it. I hadn't even looked at the date, but I was thinking about how can something so simple become such an object of ridicule, right? And something that's so necessary become so politicized, right? And it makes me think of something that we just take for granted, like our health is now politicized, or a parent being with their child if they're moving borders, or if they're going to be detained or sent back. These are things that we used to take for granted, and it's like all being stripped away. And then these images, the paintings, they're just, it kind of implicates what's happened to your community, but it's also implicating like that community in the same time.
Yeah, I also think that, it's so easy to be, dismissive of like a lot of these topics and subjects until you personally feel it. And so it's interesting how, people are so dismissive of the pandemic at being elsewhere maybe. And it's not until it hit the United States that it became fully aware, like, oh, what do you mean I can't cover my face, And so I think it's, for me, if I could, I wonder what would happen if somehow I could snap my fingers and everybody was empathetic and understanding of how we're all suffering and how we're losing human life because of the pandemic, and everyone wore a mask and everyone followed protocol, how quickly the virus would go away, or at least be minimized, to the point of it going away. So I think I'm also really interested in how you read the painting, because you saw it as a mask and it connected to the pandemic. And I think even then, like it shows the power of art to be able to talk to people that normally probably wouldn't feel anything. And they see it in image and then they connect to it because of what they're personally feeling,
Right.
So.
I thought about your last work, the work that I think is one of your most recent works, which you did, and that's probably, maybe one of the last ones we can talk about. But I want to ask about the shelter in place moment when you created I want to get the right title here.
Battle for 2020.
Battle for 2020. But before we go to that, because I don't want to end on, I just want to make sure that this is also really important to me, that I saw in your statement, and you brought up here and you foregrounded many times in your talks about your influences. And I think that the fact that you continue to put it into your statement and you talk about it and you reference it is really, it's really powerful, right? Like, I think that people try to imagine that all our issues were born with their own lifetime, right? Or with their own selves or their own family unit, right? And that these are actually continuous struggles, right? And so, and to think about the artists that came before you, or the activists that came before you, or the ordinary human beings like your grandparents that came here, right? Or have moved, or whatever it may be, the story is that these are continuous struggles. And I'm really taken and moved by your constant positioning of your influences and your mentors in your
Mm-hmm.
work as an inspiration, but the way that you always articulate it.
Mm-hmm.
That you know, I come from a part of the world that people love being first. They always say we're first show, first time an Arab done this, first time a Palestinian, and that's okay. It's great being first, but I actually think it's much more powerful to be on a continuum, to take the baton and continue the struggle, or to walk hand in hand with those who struggle with you, right? I think those are
Yeah.
extremely powerful. So I thought if we just give a few minutes for you to talk about your three influence and especially your mentor.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you worded it like that, passing the baton, and I feel like so many times where I feel like I'm not worthy of the baton. Carlos Gomez was he talked about these issues his whole life, up until he passed away, and he was so passionate, and even then, I didn't try to understand, or even it didn't milk into my consciousness. And I was too young. I was processing information when I was a student, and like, what exactly is he talking about? And so it's not until after he passed away, I was like, oh, damn, like that's what he was talking about. And so, and feeling like you don't belong, like a lot of his work dealt with identity. He was born in Mexico City, but he grew up in Texas, in South Texas, a lot. And then he went to Washington State to study, and then he was in Houston for a short period of time. And then ultimately he ended up back where he was raised. And so I started to think about that a lot. And then, and so his Chicano and Mexican American experience. And then Cesar Martinez, who's originally from Laredo, another border city. And he knew Carlos Gomez as well. So that's how I met Cesar Martinez. And then actually became friends with Cesar Martinez later. And hearing him speak about, politically and sociopolitically trepidations and what's going on in the media, and he was one of the leading Chicano figures in the 70s and 80s, and so I started paying attention to his work and how he used the figure and like an archetype of. And I kind of use it in this way. It's like an archetype, of a
Exactly.
familiar person, and so that really struck me, and they're not really specific people, but we know exactly who he's talking about. And then you have Vincent Valdez. Vincent Valdez he's only 10 years older than me, but he's talking about earlier in his formative years he talked about also the Chicano experience. So I don't want to limit him as a Chicano artist, but he's now talking about broader issues that affect American society and his own social political trepidations, and talking about white supremacy and white nationalism.
Yes, but Chicano issues are American broader issues too. They,
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, they're broad and they're narrow. It depends on,
yeah,
right? There is,
yeah,
I have to, I know you and I agree, but I just want to put it out because we have a big audience,
yeah,
and yeah, there's not an America over there that belongs to a certain group of people. If it's things that we're dealing with as indigenous, as blacks, as Latinx, as Chicanos, as Arabs, as Asians, whatever it is, those issues are American issues, right?
No,
So that is the broader American issue.
yeah, and you're correct, and I'm so happy that you brought that up. And then going back to Valdez gave me the courage to be able to talk about this stuff. Like his work is it can be subtle, but then no, it's aggressive, and it's. I saw this work of I think it was like 4 large panels that was like a one work, and it was like a family in KKK hoods, and it's painted in a way that it feels like old because it's black and white, so it feels like it's old film or something. But then you see like contemporary iconography, and it's like a brand new F 150, and then you see the modern Coca-Cola can, people using smartphones, and so it's white supremacy has been here since the beginning, but it's still here. It hasn't gone away.
Right.
It's even in going back to it's there, and you don't even realize that it's there, and so it's hidden within the crevices of American society. I think now because of this administration and what's happening today, it seems to have kind of popped up again, but it tends to hide, but it's never gone away. And so like his work really gave me the courage to be able to address some of the stuff, whether it's polarizing or not, or how people, respond to it or view it. I think it's important to be brought up. And even like I've had works like that might be interpreted like I'm pro like MAGA, but I'm critical of it. And so, but I think it's important that some sort of dialogue is happening rather than not me making the work at all.
Well, I think sometimes audiences are uncomfortable when things show a range of complexities, and you know, we're not using art as propaganda just to make a point on an agenda. There's a range of experiences that you're trying to put forward. So I would encourage everybody that is watching this to, if you haven't been to Presa House website and read Alex's statement, but the names are there: Cesar Martinez, Vincent Valdez. Your pronunciations are much better than mine. I'm sorry, and Carlos Gomez. But they're there, and I've known a couple of these artists before, but it was so wonderful this morning just spending time with all three of their works. And this is what I love about meeting artists and talking to artists, is hearing about who moves them. And so since we only have about 6 minutes left, we're gonna go into the final question, which is about the most recent work.
Yeah.
And right, being in the social distance space, and then you made a lot of different stuff in this time that you were social distanced, but this work really bizarre. A lot of things were coming into it. Some of them were complicated and difficult, and sometimes some moments of it were funny and ironic. And I think that's what makes it really. We could talk about the motifs in there. We have Trump. We have toilet paper.
Yeah.
We have the late Kobe Bryant's jersey.
Yeah.
And then talk about the overall setting for this.
Yeah, so I've seen that, that image by Jared Hall like countless times, especially when I was in undergrad, and it was the Raft of the Medusa. And if people don't know anything about it, it's about a French ship that was sinking, and so everybody on board was forced, like 150 people were forced to climb on a raft, and so they were like trying to survive, and so through time many of them died and starved, and like sickness took over, and some were forced to cannibalism. And so in the original painting you have someone waving like a shirt to a distant ship, and they're about to be rescued, the surviving members. I think at the end there was maybe like 15 or something that survived. And so the image, like the original painting, captures that beautifully. Often in the past, I've appropriated previous paintings from the past, but put them within a new context.
Right.
So that isn't anything new to me. Like I've done that before. And so I thought that was a perfect way to address like what was happening. And I was in Texas when classes were getting canceled, and I had to fly back to Tucson. And so I was like, man, how do I address this in a way that feels like someone makes sense about how I'm feeling and how chaotic it really is? I remember when I was in Austin at the time, I was like, oh my God, like I have like literally one roll of toilet paper waiting for me in Arizona. Like, how am I going to get toilet paper? And then I was like trying to how do I get my groceries delivered to me? So it was like a new world that I had to adjust to like overnight. And so I thought that even that cropping, that image, that kind of square, and the image itself is exactly 20 by 20. And so I thought that was a good way to also kind of hint at what was happening. But you have, and I replaced the shirt or the rag or whatever with the Kobe Bryant jersey. And it's not meant to glorify Kobe Bryant at all. It's more about how the year started. It started with this death that obviously affected so many people, whether you liked
the
it
major
or not.
rupture in worldwide, but stuff certainly in the United States. And it was also political. I wouldn't use the word political. It was also very complicated, given Kobe's history. I don't even want to venture into that. It's not. I'm not ready to discuss Kobe Bryant in a public forum, but it's a very complicated subject, and that's how this year started, which was very painful. Very painful for many communities, and then this happened, right?
Yeah, so you had his death, which kind of rippled throughout the States, and then you had the pandemic happen, and then so when I started this drawing, I think it was in March, and then like the whole like shortage of toilet paper is just bizarre to me anyway. So I felt that it was important to bring in. But then you have Trump hiding in the left-hand corner. He's kind of like distant and kind of hiding, and he's aware of like the chaos that's ensuing on a tiny raft. You know, like everyone's is sinking, dying, and like he doesn't know how to control it. But I wanted to bring him up because he was so dismissive of the pandemic and as if it didn't exist. And then all of this overnight, he also had to also bring it up, like, oh no, it's a real thing. So, and then he's like, no, I knew of it all along. I was taking it seriously, and I'm just like, it's so serious, but at the same so comical. How such of a poor leader he is, and so because of his poor leadership, the country has definitely been affected in such a negative way, and it's catastrophic. And so that's what I try to bring into the work. And this is even before the protests and before the BLM movement. I had concluded that, and so now I think now that the movement even amplified that even further.
I love that you can collapse humor, which I think, and satire, which I think is incredibly powerful tools to talk about pain and complicated, uncomfortable subjects. Although I don't find it painful or complicated to talk about Trump. We can talk about him, and I have no problem trashing him. But I mean, but everything that's given in this, in the seriousness of it, right? That all these people are either very sick or dying or deeply suffering. The wealth equality that's spreading in the United States, that's exasperated and by COVID, but obviously used as an excuse. The lack of attention we cannot give to the border, and what is happening in the dark, right? What is happening right now as we talk together, while our country focuses on very important things, from race to equality, to police brutality, to, you know, COVID, right? And it's happening all at once. So I do feel this, like we're all on this ship, and but I think some people have jumped off the ship and they're trying to hold the ship up.
Yeah. I think it's important to note that although we're all experiencing this together, like the pandemic is affecting everyone, whether you like it or not. But I'm also in this state of privilege to be able to have even a job. You know, I don't feel what other people who are jobless or have to feed their family are feeling, or anything. Like I don't have children. You know, I'm fortunate to have my health right now. You know, so but I am incredibly empathetic. I understand that other people have a much more difficult time compared to what I'm feeling right now. The fact that I even have a show, you know, that I can talk to you, you know, through a smartphone, you know, so it's important to take note of people's hardships.